The war had been going on for almost 40 years before humans ever showed up. Nobody in the galaxy expected them to matter much. Humans were new. Humans were small. Humans had only been part of the wider galactic community for a decade, and most of that decade had been spent learning basic manners, not building warships. That was the story everyone told themselves, at least. The Kryzel Empire had been fighting the Orsan Dominion for longer than most species could remember clearly. Whole star systems had changed hands a dozen times. Planets that once held billions of people were now empty rocks, their atmospheres stripped away by weapons that had no names polite enough to be spoken at dinner tables. Both sides had grown tired, but neither side had grown weak enough to stop. Into this endless war came a strange offer. The Galactic Council, worried that the fighting would eventually spill into neutral space, asked every member species to contribute forces to a peacekeeping fleet. Most species sent a few ships, just enough to look like they cared without risking too much. The Kryzel and the Orsan both expected humanity to do the same, if they sent anything at all. Humanity sent an entire fleet. Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the flagship, the ISS Zheng-He, watching the stars shift as the fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel. Around her, officers moved calmly between stations, checking numbers, confirming positions, doing the quiet work that always came before a big moment. Nobody on the bridge looked nervous. That was strange to the alien liaison officer standing near the back of the room, a Varathi diplomat named Osa, who had been assigned to observe humanity's first deployment into an active war zone. "Admiral," Osa said, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence, a habit that meant he was thinking carefully. "Your crew does not appear afraid." "They're not," Chen said, not turning around. "They trained for this. The war zone ahead has already destroyed 12 peacekeeping vessels from other species," Osa said. "The Orsan and Kryzel fleets do not distinguish between combatants and neutral observers anymore. Diplomacy has failed there. Only strength is respected." "Good," Chen said. "We brought strength." The Zheng-He was not a small ship. It stretched nearly 3 kilometers from bow to stern, a dark gray wedge bristling with weapon emplacements that most alien engineers considered wasteful. Why build so many guns on one ship, they had asked, when smaller, cheaper vessels could spread firepower across a wider area? Humanity had answered that question with silence, and blueprints nobody outside their military had been allowed to see. Behind the Zheng-He came the rest of the fleet, 40 cruisers, each one built for endurance and firepower rather than speed. Behind them, 60 destroyers, faster and more nimble, meant to hunt down anything that tried to slip past the main line. And behind all of that, a support fleet of supply ships, repair vessels, and something new that nobody outside humanity's military had a name for yet. Ships that looked like ordinary cargo haulers but carried enough hidden weaponry to level a moon. Osa had read the reports. He had studied the numbers. But numbers on a page were different from seeing 300 human warships slide out of hyperspace in perfect formation, their engines glowing a cold blue-white against the black of space. "This is a very large commitment," Osa said carefully, "for a species with no history in this war." Chen finally turned to look at him. She was not a tall woman, and she did not look particularly intimidating standing there in her plain gray uniform. But something in her eyes made Osa take an involuntary step back. "We were asked to keep the peace," Chen said. "So we're going to keep the peace. All of it. Everywhere it needs keeping." 300 light-years away, in a command bunker buried deep beneath the surface of a moon called Threxa Prime, the Kryzel War Council was arguing about the exact same fleet. "They are bluffing," said General Vurak Thes, slamming a clawed hand on the table hard enough to make the holographic star map flicker. "No species enters a war zone with that many ships unless they intend to use them as leverage in negotiations. Humans are new to galactic politics. They are posturing. Our scouts report the ships are fully crewed and fully armed," said Commander Yelis Nora, the intelligence officer whose job it was to know things the general did not want to hear. "Every weapon system is active. Every shield is at full power. This is not a diplomatic gesture, General. This is a war fleet." "Then it is a war fleet with no war to fight," Vurak snapped. "The humans have never engaged in real combat. Their weapons are theory. Their tactics are guesses. We have fought the Orsan for 40 years. We know war. They know simulations. Yellis said nothing, though her tail flicked with the kind of tension that Kryzel used to show doubt. She had seen the intelligence reports that never made it to the general's desk, the ones flagged by analysts who studied human military doctrine and came away unsettled rather than reassured. Humans built weapons differently. They thought about war differently. Where the Kryzel and Orsan had spent decades refining tactics against each other, learning each other's habits until the fighting had become almost predictable, humans had no habits yet. That should have made them weak. Something about it made Yellis nervous instead. "What are your orders, General?" she asked. Vurak studied the star map, where a small cluster of green dots representing the human fleet crept steadily toward the contested system of Halvourne's reach, the current front line of the endless war. "Send a message," he said. "Tell them this is Kryzel territory, contested by right of 40 years of continuous engagement. Tell them to turn back, or be treated as hostile." "And if they refuse?" Vurak smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth. "Then we will teach the newest species in the galaxy why nobody enters a war zone uninvited." The message arrived on the Jung-Hee's bridge 4 hours later, translated instantly by the ship's language systems into clear, simple text that scrolled across the main view screen. "This is General Vurak Thess of the Kryzel Empire. You are entering contested territory belonging to the Kryzel Empire by right of ongoing conflict. Turn your fleet back immediately, or you will be considered hostile forces and destroyed. You have 1 hour to comply." The bridge crew read the message in silence. Then, one by one, several of them started laughing, not loudly, not mockingly, just the quiet laugh of people who had expected exactly this and found it a little bit funny anyway. "Admiral," said Lieutenant Marcus Webb, the communications officer, "should I draft a response?" Chen read the message again, slowly, the way she read everything important. "Send this back," she said, word for word. "This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the United Nations Space Fleet. We are here under Galactic Council authority to establish a peacekeeping presence in this system. We are not turning back. If you fire on this fleet, we will consider it an act of war against humanity and respond accordingly. You have 1 hour to reconsider." Webb typed quickly, then looked up. "That's very direct, Admiral." "They were direct with us," Chen said. It seemed rude not to return the favor. Osa, still standing near the back of the bridge, felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had watched dozens of first contacts between species over his career. He had seen posturing, seen bluffs, seen careful diplomatic dances meant to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation. He had never seen a species respond to a direct threat with something that sounded less like defiance and more like simple, calm fact. "Admiral," he said, "may I ask what you intend to do if the Kryzel fleet attacks?" Chen glanced at him, and for a moment her expression softened, just slightly. "Osa, I know you're worried. I know this looks reckless to you, but we didn't come here without knowing what we were walking into. We studied this war. We studied both sides. We know how the Kryzel fight, and we know how the Orsan fight, and neither of them fight the way we do. How do you fight?" Osa asked. Chen looked back at the view screen, where the edge of the contested system was just becoming visible, a smear of distant starlight and drifting debris from 40 years of unbroken war. "You'll see," she said. "In less than an hour, probably." The Kryzel fleet that gathered to meet the humans was not small. General Vurak had pulled ships from 3 different fronts to assemble a force of 200 vessels, a mix of heavy cruisers, strike carriers, and swarms of small, fast fighters, meant to overwhelm enemy defenses through sheer numbers. It was, by Kryzel standards, an impressive show of force, more than enough to have crushed most fleets they had faced in the war so far. Vurak stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Devouring Storm, watching the human fleet approach on the tactical display. 200 Kryzel ships against roughly the same number of human vessels. Numbers alone suggested an even fight, maybe even a Kryzel advantage, given decades of combat experience against a determined enemy. "Their formation is unusual," said his tactical officer, a younger Kryzel named Dresh, who had not yet lost the nervous energy of someone new to command decisions. "They are not spreading out. They are staying tightly grouped." "A mistake," Vurak said, Tight formations are vulnerable to concentrated fire. Our fighters will slip through the gaps and strike their support vessels first. Should we hail them one more time, General? Vurak considered this for a moment, then shook his head. No, they had their chance to turn back. Now we show them what happens to those who ignore a warning in Kryzel space. The order went out across the fleet. 200 ships began to move, sliding into an attack formation that had worked countless times against the Orsan Dominion. A wide net, designed to surround an enemy fleet and cut off any avenue of retreat, followed by a concentrated assault from the strongest ships, while fighters harassed the edges and forced gaps to open in enemy defenses. It was a good plan. It had won battles before. It had never been tested against an opponent like the one now sliding steadily closer through the dark. On the Zhenghe, Admiral Chen watched the Kryzel fleet begin its encircling maneuver and felt nothing that looked like fear. She had reviewed this exact tactic in briefings weeks earlier, studying decades of Kryzel battle records that the Galactic Council had shared as part of the peacekeeping mission's preparation. She knew what was coming. She had planned for it. "They're forming the net," said her tactical officer, Commander James Okafor, watching the same maneuver unfold on his own display, just like the briefing said they would. "Let them," Chen said. "Hold formation. Do not fire until they're inside optimal range. I want this to be quick." "Quick, Admiral?" Chen nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the approaching wall of enemy ships. There's no reason to drag this out. Every minute this battle continues is a minute more people die, on both sides. If we can end this fast, we should. Osa, listening from his position near the back of the bridge, felt his 4 eyes widen. He had assumed, like everyone else observing this deployment, that humanity's confidence was a kind of bravado, a show of strength meant to intimidate before the reality of battle forced a more careful, more desperate response. But Chen was not talking about surviving the coming fight. She was talking about ending it. "Admiral," he said quietly, "you sound very certain." "We are," Chen said. "Watch." The Kryzel fleet closed the distance, their net formation tightening around the human ships like a fist closing around something small and fragile. On the bridge of the devouring storm, General Vurak allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. In moments, his fighters would slip through the gaps in the human formation, and the slaughter would begin. "Fighters, engage," he ordered. "Show them why this is Kryzel territory." Hundreds of small, fast Kryzel fighters broke from the main fleet and streaked toward the human ships, weapons charging, engines burning bright against the darkness of space. It was the opening move of a tactic that had worked, in one form or another, for 40 years of continuous war. On the Zhenghe, Commander Okafor's hands hovered over the weapons controls, waiting for the order that he knew was about to come. "Admiral," he said, "fighters entering weapons range in 10 seconds. Chen watched the swarm of enemy fighters close in, calm and steady, the way she had watched 100 training simulations that had prepared her for exactly this moment. "All right," she said. "Let's begin." She looked at Okafor, and something in her expression made the entire bridge crew fall silent, waiting. "Fire everything," she said. And the sky lit up. Light does not travel instantly, but in space combat, weapons fire close enough to that speed that the difference barely matters to the people watching it happen. When Admiral Chen gave the order to fire, every human ship in the fleet responded within the same half-second, 300 vessels unleashing everything they had at once. The Kryzel fighter swarm, which General Vurak had expected to slip neatly through gaps in the human formation, simply ceased to exist. Not damaged, not scattered. Gone, all 400 of them, in the space of a single breath. Where a wall of small, fast attack ships had been streaking toward the human fleet a moment earlier, there was now only drifting debris and the fading glow of destroyed engines. On the devouring storm, General Vurak stared at his tactical display, and for the first time in 40 years of war, he did not understand what he was looking at. "Status," he barked. "What happened to the fighter wing?" "Destroyed," said Dresch, his voice thin with shock. "All of them, General, in under 2 seconds." "That's not possible," Vurak said. "No weapon system can track and destroy 400 individual targets that quickly. Not even Orsan point defense grids can manage that kind of response time." Human weapons appear to be firing in coordinated bursts, Dresh said, pulling up sensor data as fast as his shaking hands could manage. Multiple ships targeting the same area simultaneously, with firing solutions calculated across the entire fleet at once. It's like the whole fleet is one weapon system, General. Vurak felt something he had not felt in a very long time, the cold, creeping edge of doubt. He pushed it down. 40 years of war had taught him that any enemy, no matter how strange their weapons, could be beaten with the right tactics. Concentrate all remaining forces on their flagship, he ordered. If we destroy their command vessel, the rest of their fleet will be disorganized. That is how we win this. The order went out, and 180 remaining Kryzel warships turned their weapons toward the Zhenghe, unleashing a barrage of energy weapons and missiles that, against most fleets in the galaxy, would have been more than enough to cripple even the toughest flagship. On the bridge of the Zhenghe, alarms chimed softly, almost politely, as the ship's defense systems registered the incoming attack. "Incoming fire, Admiral," said Okafor. "Shields at 98% and holding steady." Chen nodded, unsurprised. "Return fire on designated targets. Group Alpha, take the cruisers on the left flank. Group Beta, the carriers in the center. Group Gamma, hold position and watch for anything trying to flank us." Osa, still standing near the back of the bridge, watched numbers scroll across a secondary display that had been set up for observers, showing shield integrity, weapons status, and enemy losses in real time. The numbers did not make sense to him. Human shields were absorbing weapons fire that should have, by any reasonable calculation, been punching straight through and gutting the ship's interior. "Your shields," he said, his translated voice unsteady. "How are they holding against a barrage of that size?" "Layered defense grids," Chen said, not looking away from the tactical display. "Each ship in the fleet contributes power to a shared shield network. We're not 300 ships fighting alone, Osa. We're one fleet, sharing everything. Shields, sensors, weapons targeting. It's slower to set up than fighting independently, but once it's running, it's very hard to break." Osa said nothing. He was beginning to understand, slowly and with a growing sense of dread, exactly what humanity had brought into this war zone. 11 seconds into the battle, the Kryzel fleet had lost its entire fighter wing and had failed to so much as scratch the shields of a single human vessel. General Vurak, watching his tactical display with mounting horror, ordered his heavy cruisers to break formation and attempt a direct assault, hoping that closing the distance would allow his weapons to punch through whatever defensive system the humans were using. It did not work. As the Kryzel cruisers surged forward, human destroyers peeled away from the main fleet formation with a speed and precision that looked less like military maneuvering and more like a single, coordinated organism responding to a threat. They did not charge in recklessly. They moved in tight groups, covering each other's blind spots, weapons firing in careful, overlapping patterns that left no gap for a Kryzel ship to exploit. "They're not even trying to hit individual targets," Dresh said, watching in disbelief, as 3 Kryzel cruisers vanished from the tactical display within seconds of each other. "They're calculating the most efficient firing pattern for the whole group and executing it as one unit." "How is that possible?" Vurak demanded. "No crew can process that much information and react that quickly." "It's not the crew doing the calculations, General," Dresh said quietly. "I think it's their ship's computers, working together, all 300 of them at once." Vurak stared at the display, watching his fleet die in real time, ship after ship, blinking out of existence, as human weapons fire found them, with a precision that felt less like combat and more like a demonstration. He thought of the message he had sent hours earlier, warning the humans to turn back or be destroyed. He thought of his own confidence, his certainty that 40 years of war experience would be more than enough to handle a species with no combat history of their own. He had been wrong. He understood that now, watching his fleet collapse in front of him, but understanding it did not change what was happening. "All ships," he said, his voice tight, "focus fire on the human flagship. If we cannot win this battle, we will at least take their commander with us." It was, in the end, a desperate order from a commander who had run out of good options. 50 remaining Kryzel warships turned every weapon they had toward the Zhenghe, firing everything at once, in a final, concentrated assault meant to overwhelm the human flagship's defenses through sheer volume. On the bridge of the Zheng-He, Chen watched the incoming barrage with the same calm expression she had worn since the battle began. "Shields at 81%, Okafor reported. "Holding, Admiral, but that was their strongest attack yet." "Understood," Chen said. "Time to end this. Full fleet, concentrate fire on the remaining Kryzel ships. All groups, converge on their positions." The response was immediate and absolute. Every remaining human warship, having already destroyed the majority of the Kryzel fleet, turned its full attention to the 50 ships still fighting, unleashing a coordinated barrage that no defense system in the galaxy could have withstood. The devouring storm was among the first to fall, its shields collapsing under the weight of concentrated fire from a dozen human cruisers before its hull cracked open and spilled its contents into the void. General Vurak Thes did not survive to see the rest of his fleet destroyed in the seconds that followed, though it would not have mattered much if he had. There was nothing left for him to command. 43 seconds after Admiral Chen gave the order to fire, the last Kryzel warship in the contested system exploded into a cloud of debris, and the battle was over. On the bridge of the Zheng-He, silence settled over the crew. Not the tense silence of people who had just survived a desperate fight, but the quiet, satisfied stillness of people who had done exactly what they had planned to do, exactly as well as they had planned to do it. "Battle status," Chen said. "Enemy fleet destroyed," Okafor reported. 200 vessels, 0 survivors detected. Our losses, 0 ships, minor shield damage across 4 vessels, no casualties reported fleet-wide. Osa stood frozen near the back of the bridge, his 4 eyes wide, staring at the tactical display where, less than a minute earlier, 200 Kryzel warships had been arranged in a confident attack formation. Now there was nothing there but drifting wreckage and the fading heat signatures of destroyed engines. "That took," he said slowly, "less than a minute. 43 seconds, Chen confirmed, finally allowing herself something that looked like a small, tired smile. "A little longer than we projected in training, honestly. Their shield technology was better than our intelligence suggested." "You expected this," Osa said. It was not quite a question. You expected to destroy an entire fleet of 200 warships in under a minute, and you were disappointed it took 43 seconds instead of less. "We didn't come here to fight a long war, Osa," Chen said, turning to face him fully for the first time since the battle had begun. "We came here to stop one. If we're going to use force, we want to use it fast. And we want to use it in a way that makes both sides understand. There's no point continuing to fight us. Long, drawn-out battles just mean more death. We don't see the appeal in that." Osa looked back at the tactical display, at the drifting debris of a fleet that had, until a few minutes ago, represented a significant portion of the Kryzel Empire's military strength in this sector. He thought about Vurak's message, the confident warning to turn back or be destroyed. He thought about 40 years of war between the Kryzel and the Orsan, a conflict that had ground on with no clear end in sight, consuming ships and lives at a pace that had become almost normal to everyone in the galaxy except, apparently, to humanity. "The Orsan fleet in this sector will have observed this battle," he said slowly. "What do you intend to do now?" Chen turned back to the main view screen, where the wreckage of the Kryzel fleet drifted silently against the stars. "Now," she said, "we send them the same message we sent the Kryzel, and we hope they make a better decision than General Vurak did." She paused, watching the debris field for a long moment before speaking again, her voice quiet but certain. "But if they don't," she said, "we're ready for that too." Behind her, the human fleet began to reform, 300 ships sliding back into formation, with the same quiet efficiency they had shown throughout the entire battle, already preparing for whatever came next. On secondary displays throughout the ship, technical crews began compiling battle data, weapons performance reports, and shield efficiency numbers that would be studied and refined for the next engagement, whenever and wherever it came. Osa watched all of this happen around him, the calm, methodical aftermath of a battle that had ended a 40-year stalemate's local chapter in less time than it took to walk from one end of the ship to the other, and understood, with a growing sense of unease, that the galaxy he had known before today no longer existed in quite the same way. Humanity had entered the war zone, and the war zone would never be the same again. News of the battle at Halvourne's Reach spread through the galaxy faster than any official report could travel. Ships passing through neutral space carried the story from bar to bar, station to station, each retelling adding a little more detail, a little more disbelief. By the time the story reached the Orsan Dominion's high command, it had already been confirmed by 3 separate sources, including a badly damaged Kryzel scout ship that had fled the battle before the final shots were fired. Fleet Marshal Karl Rethus, Supreme Commander of Orsan military forces, read the report twice before setting it down on his desk. He was an old soldier, old enough to remember the earliest days of the war with the Kryzel, back when both sides still believed the conflict would be over within a few years. 40 years later, he had learned not to be surprised by much of anything. This report surprised him. 200 Kryzel warships, he said slowly, destroyed in under a minute, by a fleet with no prior combat experience. "That is the assessment, Fleet Marshal," said his aide, a younger officer named Pren, who had delivered the report with visible unease. "Our own scouts have confirmed the wreckage field. There is no indication of deception. The battle happened exactly as described." Rethus stood and walked to the window of his command post, looking out over the shipyards of Orsan Prime, where new warships were under construction, at a pace that had barely kept up with 40 years of continuous losses. He thought about the resources it had taken to build the Dominion's current fleet, the generations of soldiers who had given their lives fighting the Kryzel for territory that changed hands so often it had become almost meaningless. "What is your assessment of this human fleet's capabilities?" he asked. Pren hesitated before answering. "Uncertain, Fleet Marshal. Their shield technology appears to operate on principles we do not fully understand. Their weapons systems fire with a coordination that suggests either extremely advanced computing technology or some form of direct neural linkage between ships. Their tactical decision-making was..." He paused again. "It was efficient beyond anything in our records. They ended a 200-ship engagement in under a minute with 0 losses. And now they are moving toward our sector," Rethus said. It was not a question. "Yes, Fleet Marshal. Their fleet remains in the Halvourne's Reach system, but scouts report they are preparing to advance further into the contested territories. Given their stated mission, peacekeeping under Galactic Council authority, it is likely they intend to establish a presence throughout the war zone, including areas currently under Orsan control." Rethus was quiet for a long moment, watching the shipyards below, the endless activity of a species that had built its entire civilization around the machinery of an unending war. "Send a diplomatic envoy," he said finally. "Not a fleet, a single ship, unarmed, requesting a formal meeting with the human commander. I want to understand what we are dealing with before I decide whether we are dealing with an enemy or something else entirely." Pren blinked in surprise. "Fleet Marshal, the Kryzel attempted diplomacy through threats and were destroyed for it. Should we not respond with force, to demonstrate that the Dominion will not be intimidated?" Rethus turned to look at his aide, and there was something tired in his expression, the exhaustion of a man who had spent 4 decades fighting a war he no longer fully remembered the original reasons for. 200 warships destroyed in under a minute, Pren," he said quietly, "with 0 losses on the other side. Tell me, honestly, do you believe force is the correct response to that?" Pren said nothing, because he did not have a good answer. "Send the envoy," Rethus said again, "and pray that this human commander is interested in something other than conquest." Aboard the Zhenghe, the mood in the days following the battle at Halvourne's Reach was quieter than Osa had expected. He had assumed, based on his experience with other species, that a victory of this scale would be celebrated, discussed, perhaps even boasted about among the crew. Instead, he found the human sailors going about their duties with the same calm efficiency they had shown during the battle itself, as though destroying an entire enemy fleet in under a minute was simply another task to be completed and moved past. He found Admiral Chen in the ship's observation deck, standing in front of a wide viewport that looked out over the debris field still drifting through the Halvourne's Reach system. Salvage crews worked slowly among the wreckage, recovering what could be recovered, both from the destroyed Kryzel ships and from the region's own long history of conflict. "You are recovering the wreckage," Osa said, stepping up beside her. May I ask why? The Kryzel ships are destroyed. There is little strategic value in the debris. There are survivors sometimes, Chen said. Escape pods, damaged sections that held pressure long enough for someone to survive. We're recovering anyone we can find, Kryzel or otherwise, and treating them according to Galactic Council protocols for wartime medical care. Osa's eyes widened slightly. You are rescuing the crews of the fleet that attacked you. We're rescuing survivors, Chen corrected gently. The battle is over. There's no reason for anyone else to die because of it, if we can prevent it. This, more than the battle itself, was what finally began to change how Osa understood humanity. He had spent his career studying different species, cataloging their strengths and weaknesses, their customs and philosophies, and he had developed, over many years, a fairly reliable sense of how most cultures approached warfare. Aggression was usually paired with either cruelty or indifference toward defeated enemies. Strength was usually used to punish, or to make a point, or simply because it could be. Humanity, it seemed, used its strength differently. I do not understand, he admitted. You are capable of destroying entire fleets with almost no risk to yourselves. You could conquer significant portions of this war zone if you wished. Yet you rescue your enemies and speak of ending the war rather than exploiting your advantage. Chen was quiet for a moment, watching the salvage crews work among the wreckage below. Osa, can I tell you something that might sound strange, she said. Humanity spent most of its history fighting itself. Wars, all sorts of wars, for thousands of years, over land and resources and ideas, and things that, looking back, usually weren't worth the cost. We got very, very good at fighting. We got so good at it that eventually we had to decide, as a species, what we actually wanted to do with that ability. And what did you decide? That we didn't want to fight anymore, unless we had to, Chen said. But if we had to, we wanted to be good enough at it that we could end things quickly, with as little suffering as possible, and then move on to actually solving the problem that caused the fighting in the first place. War doesn't fix anything by itself. It just clears the way for people to actually fix things, if they choose to. We'd rather skip straight to the fixing part when we can. Osa considered this for a long moment, looking out at the drifting wreckage of the Kryzel fleet, at the small shuttles moving carefully among the debris, searching for survivors among a defeated enemy that, by most standards he had encountered in his career, would have simply been left to die. The Orsan Dominion has sent a diplomatic envoy, he said finally. An unarmed ship, requesting a formal meeting with you. Chen nodded, unsurprised. I heard. Their fleet marshal must be smarter than the Kryzel general was. Will you meet with them? Of course, Chen said. That's what we're here for, Osa. Ending this war, one way or another. We'd much rather do it with a meeting than a battle. She turned away from the viewport, glancing back at Osa, with an expression that was, for the first time since he had met her, something close to hopeful. Let's go find out if the Orsan Dominion wants to talk, she said. And let's hope, for everyone's sake, that they do. The Orsan diplomatic ship arrived at Halvourne's Reach 3 days after the battle. A small, unarmed vessel escorted at a respectful distance by 2 human destroyers. Fleet Marshal Karl Rethis did not come in person. That would have been too great a risk for a first meeting with an unknown power. Instead, he sent his senior diplomatic officer, an Orsan named Vesa Kethran, along with a small team of advisors and, at Rethis's insistence, a full recording of the meeting to be sent back to Orsan Prime the moment it concluded. Vesa had prepared for many possible outcomes when she boarded the Jung-Hee. She had prepared for arrogance, for threats, for the kind of posturing that often followed a decisive military victory. She had not prepared for what she actually found, a conference room, simply furnished, where Admiral Chen stood to greet her with what appeared to be genuine courtesy, offering a seat and a drink before any discussion of business began. Thank you for coming, Chen said, once introductions had been made and everyone was seated around the table. I know it took courage, given what happened here a few days ago. The Fleet Marshal wished to understand your intentions before deciding on a response, Vesa said carefully, watching Chen's expression for any sign of the aggression she had expected. 200 Kryzel warships destroyed in under a minute is difficult to interpret as anything other than a demonstration of overwhelming force. It was a demonstration, Chen admitted. But not the kind you might think. We didn't come here to conquer territory, or to pick a side in your war with the Kryzel. We came here because the Galactic Council asked us to help establish peace in this region, and General Vurak Thes decided to test whether we were serious about that mission. And you responded by destroying his entire fleet. He attacked first, Chen said, her tone even but firm. We gave him the chance to stand down. He chose not to take it. I won't apologize for defending my fleet, Ambassador Catherine, but I also won't pretend that was our preferred outcome. We would have much rather sat down and talked, the way we're talking now. Vesa studied Chen for a long moment, searching for the deception she was certain must be somewhere beneath the calm, reasonable words. She had spent her career as a diplomat during a war that had consumed her entire adult life, and she had learned, through painful experience, that words offered in negotiation rarely matched actions taken on the battlefield. But the more she looked, the less deception she found. Just a tired, careful honesty that reminded her, uncomfortably, of the earliest days of the Orsan Kryzel War, before both sides had hardened into the bitter, exhausted stalemate that had defined the last several decades. What exactly does humanity want from this conflict, she asked finally. If not territory, not resources, not victory over one side or the other, what is the purpose of your involvement here? Chen leaned forward slightly, folding her hands on the table. We want the war to end, Ambassador. Both sides have been fighting for 40 years, and from everything we've studied, neither side is meaningfully closer to victory than they were at the start. Millions of people have died. Dozens of planets have been damaged beyond recovery, some of them permanently. This isn't a war anymore. It's a machine that keeps running because nobody's found a way to turn it off. And you believe humanity is capable of turning it off? We believe we can help, Chen said. The Galactic Council gave us this mission because they believe the same thing. We're not asking either side to surrender, and we're not asking anyone to give up territory they're not willing to give up. We're asking both sides to sit down and actually talk about what would need to happen for this war to end, instead of just continuing to fight, because fighting has become the only thing anyone remembers how to do. Vesa was silent for a long moment, considering this. Around the table, her advisors exchanged uncertain glances, unsure how to respond to an offer that sounded almost too straightforward to trust. The Fleet Marshal will want proof that this offer is genuine, she said finally. Forgive me for saying so, Admiral, but a fleet capable of destroying 200 warships in under a minute is not easily trusted, regardless of what words accompany its arrival. That's fair, Chen said. So let me offer something concrete. We'll establish a neutral zone here, at Halvourne's Reach, patrolled by our fleet and open to representatives from both the Orsan Dominion and the Kryzel Empire. Any attacks against this zone will be treated as hostile acts against humanity, regardless of which side initiates them. That includes attacks by the Orsan Dominion, Ambassador. We're not choosing a side here. We're just trying to hold a space open long enough for people to talk. And if the Kryzel Empire refuses to participate, having already lost a fleet to your forces. Chen's expression grew a little more serious. Then we'll continue reaching out to them, the same way we reached out to you. We're not interested in punishing the Kryzel for General Vurak's decision. He made a choice, and that choice cost his fleet everything. But that doesn't mean the entire Kryzel Empire deserves to be treated as an enemy. We're hoping cooler heads within their command structure will be willing to talk, now that they've seen what happens when they don't. The meeting continued for several more hours, working through details that would eventually become the framework for what history would later call the Halvourne Accords, the first formal step toward ending a war that had consumed two civilizations for 40 years. Vesa Catherine returned to Orsan Prime with a recommendation that surprised even her own advisors, that the Dominion should accept humanity's offer, cautiously, but with genuine hope that this new arrival to galactic politics might succeed, where 40 years of exhausted, bitter conflict had failed. Fleet Marshal Rethus reviewed the recording of the meeting personally, watching Chen's careful, measured responses with the same close attention he had once given to the battle reports from Halvourne's Reach. She could have used that fleet to force any terms she wanted, he said to Vesa, once the recording had finished. Instead, she offered a neutral zone and a chance to talk. Why? I asked her something similar, Vesa said. She told me that force is easy, But peace requires something harder: trust. And trust can't be forced. No matter how powerful your fleet is, it has to be built, slowly, by people willing to keep showing up and keep talking, even when it would be easier not to. Rethus was quiet for a long moment, thinking about 40 years of war, about the countless battles that had achieved nothing except more battles, about a species newly arrived to galactic politics that had somehow, in a single decisive action, done more to change the shape of this conflict than 4 decades of Orsan and Kryzel military strategy combined. "Send word to the Kryzel High Command," he said finally, "through neutral channels, quietly. Tell them the Dominion is prepared to discuss the human offer, and ask whether they are prepared to do the same. And if they refuse?" Rethus looked toward the window, toward the distant stars where, somewhere far beyond his sight, a human fleet waited patiently at Halvourne's reach, holding open a space for peace that neither side had been able to create on their own. "Then we will have lost nothing by trying," he said. "And if there is even a small chance that this works, Vesa, a small chance that this war, after everything it has cost both our peoples, might actually end, then I think we have an obligation to try." Vesa nodded, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself something she had almost forgotten how to feel: a small, cautious hope that the future might look different than the past 40 years had taught her to expect. The Kryzel High Command did not respond quickly. For weeks after the battle at Halvourne's Reach, the Empire's leadership remained divided, split between officers who wanted immediate retaliation against the humans and those who, quietly and carefully, began to argue that General Vurak Thes had made a catastrophic error in judgment that the entire Empire should not be forced to pay for. It was Commander Yelis Nora, the intelligence officer who had warned Vurak about the danger of underestimating humanity before the battle ever began, who finally tipped the balance. She presented the full record of the engagement to the Kryzel War Council, not just the battle itself, but the days that followed, the recovery of survivors, the diplomatic outreach to the Orsan Dominion, the offer of a neutral zone open to both sides. "They rescued our people," she told the council, standing before officers who had spent 40 years learning to see the Orsan Dominion, and by extension any new threat, as an enemy to be destroyed rather than understood. Survivors from ships that attacked them without provocation. They gave them medical care according to council protocols and returned them to Kryzel space without demands, without ransom, without conditions of any kind. "A tactic," said one of the older generals, unconvinced. "Meant to make us lower our guard." "Perhaps," Yelis said. "But consider this, honored council members. If humanity wanted to conquer this war zone, they had every opportunity to do so after destroying General Vurak's fleet. Our defenses in this sector were in disarray. They could have pressed the advantage and taken significant territory before we could reorganize. Instead, they held position at Halvourne's Reach and reached out to the Orsan Dominion with an offer of peace talks. That is not the behavior of a conqueror, General. That is the behavior of a species that genuinely wants this war to end." The debate continued for hours, but in the end, exhaustion proved a more persuasive argument than pride. 40 years of war had cost the Kryzel Empire more than most of its citizens fully understood, and the promise of an actual path toward peace, however uncertain, was not something the council could easily dismiss, not when the alternative had already demonstrated, in less than a minute, exactly what continued resistance would cost. The Kryzel Empire agreed to send representatives to Halvourne's Reach. 6 months later, Admiral Sarah Chen stood once again on the observation deck of the Zheng He, looking out over a very different Halvourne's Reach than the one her fleet had first entered. The debris fields had been cleared, mostly, by joint salvage operations conducted by Orsan, Kryzel, and human crews working side by side, a small but meaningful symbol of a peace that was still fragile, still uncertain, but real, in a way that had seemed impossible just months earlier. The formal peace talks had not been easy. 40 years of grievances, territorial disputes, and lost lives could not be resolved in a handful of meetings, no matter how sincerely both sides wanted the war to end. There had been moments when the talks nearly collapsed entirely, when old wounds and deep mistrust threatened to undo months of careful, patient work. But the neutral zone had held, and slowly, painstakingly, Both the Orsan Dominion and the Chryzel Empire had found their way toward something that, while not a complete resolution, was at least a genuine ceasefire, the first real pause in the fighting in 4 decades. Osa found her there, as he often did in the quiet hours when the ship's daily operations settled into a calm rhythm. He had remained with the human fleet throughout the negotiations, watching, recording, and slowly coming to understand a species that had changed the trajectory of an entire region of the galaxy in less time than most diplomatic missions took just to schedule their first meeting. "The Galactic Council has requested a full report on your methods," he said, stepping up beside her at the viewport. "They wish to understand how a single fleet accomplished what decades of diplomatic effort could not." "What are you going to tell them?" Chen asked, glancing at him with a small, tired smile. Osa considered the question carefully, thinking back over everything he had witnessed since first boarding the Zhenghe. The battle that had ended in under a minute, the careful compassion shown to defeated enemies, the patient, unglamorous work of diplomacy that had followed, month after month, without any of the dramatic flourishes he might have expected from a species that had proven itself so overwhelmingly capable in combat. "I am going to tell them," he said slowly, "that humanity understood something the rest of us had forgotten after 40 years of war. That strength and mercy are not opposites. That the purpose of power is not to dominate, but to create the conditions where dominance is no longer necessary. I am going to tell them that you ended a war, not because you were the strongest fleet in this sector, though you certainly were, but because you were willing to use that strength to build something instead of simply winning." Chen was quiet for a long moment, watching the neutral zone below, where Orsan, Chryzel, and human vessels now moved in careful, cautious proximity, still wary of each other but no longer actively trying to destroy one another. "That's kind of you to say," she said finally, "but I think you're giving us too much credit. We didn't do anything especially clever, Osa. We just refused to accept that the war had to keep going the way it always had. Sometimes that's all it takes. Someone willing to say, quietly and firmly, that things don't have to stay broken just because they've been broken for a long time. And if the Chryzel or the Orsan had refused your offer, if neither side had been willing to talk." Chen's expression grew more serious, though her voice remained calm. "Then we would have kept the neutral zone open anyway, for as long as it took. And if either side had tried to break it by force, we would have responded the same way we responded to General Vurak, quickly, decisively, and with as little unnecessary suffering as we could manage. We didn't come here hoping for peace instead of strength, Osa. We came here believing that real strength includes knowing when, and how, to use it for something better than just winning." Osa looked out at the neutral zone, at ships from 3 different species moving carefully around each other in a fragile, hopeful peace that had seemed impossible only 6 months earlier. He thought about the story that would eventually spread across the galaxy. Not just the story of a battle won in under a minute, though that story would certainly be told and retold for years to come, but the quieter, more important story of what had happened afterward. The rescue of enemy survivors, the patient diplomacy, the refusal to exploit a decisive victory for anything more than the chance to end a war that had already cost too much. "The Galactic Council will want more from humanity, going forward," he said. "Other conflicts, other war zones. Word of what happened here has already spread far beyond this sector." Chen nodded slowly, unsurprised. "We know, and will help where we can, the same way we helped here. Not because we want to control the outcome, but because we believe that when war becomes the only thing anyone remembers how to do, sometimes it takes someone new, someone without 40 years of old grievances weighing them down, to show that there's still another way forward." She turned from the viewport, looking at Osa with an expression that held both quiet confidence and genuine humility, a combination he had come to recognize, over the past 6 months, as something distinctly and uniquely human. "The enemy fleet lasted less than a minute against us, Osa," she said. "But that was never really the point. The point was everything that came after. That's what we hope people remember when they tell this story. Not how fast we won a battle, but what we chose to do once it was over." Behind her, through the observation deck's wide viewport, the neutral zone at Halvourne's reach continued its slow, careful work of building something new out of the wreckage of 40 years of war. A fragile peace, hard won, and still uncertain, but real, and growing stronger with each day that passed without another shot fired. It was, Osa thought, watching the quiet activity below, exactly the kind of ending that humanity seemed to prefer. Not loud, not triumphant, but steady, patient, and built to last. The war was not fully over. There would be more talks, more disputes, more difficult days ahead before the Orsan Dominion and the Kryzel Empire could call their conflict truly resolved. But for the first time in 40 years, there was a real path forward, and it had been humanity, arriving late and untested into an ancient war that had shown both sides the way to find it. And across the galaxy, in council chambers and command bunkers, and quiet diplomatic offices belonging to a dozen different species, the story of what had happened at Halvourne's Reach continued to spread. Not just the story of a battle won in less than a minute, but the story of what humanity had chosen to do with that victory, and what it might mean for every conflict still waiting, somewhere out among the stars, for someone brave enough and patient enough to end it.